Would you help me out this morning in welcoming Pastor Lance Nelson to the pulpit as he's going to bring the word today? That's on, ready to go. Thank you, buddy. Thank you.
Pastor Chris, I love you, friend, and I thank you for the opportunity to come this morning and to share with this great congregation. I told him when I got here last night, they were in here wrapping up worship practice, and I walked in, I said, my goodness, I'm at the ends of the earth. And he said, no, you're right in the middle. So then he explained that this is like the geographic center of the United States. So, wow, how far can you go into the forest, right? Halfway. If you go any farther, you're going out. This is a palace on the prairie, my friend. This is a beautiful church. And let me tell you something about Pastor Chris that you probably already know, although I know he and his family haven't been here all that long. He's the real deal. He really loves the Lord, and he really loves this congregation. I followed him on his journey as he came to know you and as he came this direction and got acquainted with this congregation. And just to watch him light up when he talks about you and what God is doing in this church is evidence of a true pastor's heart. So I appreciate this, brother. Take good care of him, okay? And I saw in the bulletin, I'm glad you mentioned it this morning, I saw that your wife's birthday is tomorrow. Okay, my wife and I pastored churches for years, and I just want to tell you, it's such a blessing when your congregation remembers you on your birthday. So be sure and spoil Sister Pastor when you see her, okay? Take good care of her. So I bring you greetings today from beautiful Hot Springs, Arkansas, home of Hillcrest Children's Home. Before I go any farther, I just want to see by show of hands, how many of you in here are familiar with Hillcrest Children's Home? When I say that, you know what I'm talking about. All the way over here, about half of the congregation knows what Hillcrest Children's Home is. Fantastic. Hillcrest, of course, is the national children's home for the Assemblies of God. It was started in the mid-1940s by a woman by the name of Gladys Henson, who had a passion to go overseas to China. She wanted to go start an orphanage over there. And, of course, right in the middle of the 1940s was another little thing that was happening around the globe, World War II. And the powers that be in Springfield would not release Gladys Henson to go do that. So she had to pray about built a small, modest home and began to take in children who didn't have families. And over time, other churches got behind her and began to support her and just viewed it as a mission, a work of missions. And today we have over 50 acres on that same spot of land. We have 26 buildings. We have 10 cottages where we do residential family-style care for foster children. So we have small home-like settings with foster parents that live with these kids round the clock and take care of their needs and do it as much as possible like a family. So that's what Hillcrest is. So what is Compact Family Services? I'm glad you asked. About 8 years ago, we began to see the writing on the wall. And we began to understand that the need for foster care and the need for children who are not able to be with their families to have family-style care was far greater than we were going to be able to meet on that 50-acre campus. On any given day in the United States, there are something like 440,000 children in the foster care system. And if we are completely full on our campus, we can service about 70 children in any given day. So you can see that we're a long way from being able to meet the need. So about 8 years ago, we began to pray and we began to ask the Lord, what can we do to maximize our influence? And as we began to pray, the Lord began to give us some direction. And that direction was, take everything we've learned about foster care over the last 70 years, take everything we've learned about redeeming families, bottle it up, and export it to local churches coast to coast. So we began to develop a wraparound model of ministry that we eventually titled CompaCare, and it's a method that a church can use to wrap around and support foster families in a way that makes them successful, in a similar way to what we do on our campus, as far as we wrap around and support the little individual family units that we have on our campus. And so we've begun to teach churches how to do this, coast to coast. We now have active CompaCare presences in 13 states and 77 churches as of a couple of weeks ago, and we've trained and deployed some since then. So we've only been at this about a year. We published the material about a year ago, and I believe it was it November that you guys were with us back in the fall? Pastor Chris came, brought Tim and Denise. Shane, where's Shane? Over here. This team came to our campus in Hot Springs and spent a couple of days with us learning how to get involved in this extremely vital ministry. So that's what we're doing, and we rebranded. We still have Hillcrest Children's Home. That's our flagship ministry, but we rebranded as Compact Family Services, which is a mashup of the words compassionate action. That's what compact means to us. So Compact Family Services is better reflective of what we're doing nationwide. Hillcrest is our children's home that sits on the crest of a hill in Hot Springs, Arkansas. And Compact Family Services is the compassionate action arm of what we want to do in churches all across America. And we want to change the way that America cares for vulnerable kids. God bring that kind of healing and wholeness that only He can do. So Hillcrest, of course, is our flagship ministry. Hillcrest is, that's what's been around forever, and that's what everybody knows about. We have a couple of other ministries that are based on that campus. One of the ministries is our Transitional Living Center, which is essentially an apartment building that is designed for kids that are aging out of care. So once those kids they turn 18 and they don't necessarily have anywhere else to go, we put them up in one of these apartments and we give them some independent living skills. We teach them how to be an adult. And then we also have another ministry there. How many of you have heard the term or the name Highlands Maternity Home? Does that ring a bell? It's a handful of you. Highlands originally was in Kansas City, Missouri, and about 15 years ago it merged with our campus. And so we now have Highlands on our campus, on our 50-acre campus. Highlands originally was designed as a home for unwed mothers, because way back in the day when a woman found herself a child and she had no way to support herself, she needed some kind of support. And so Highlands was designed to be the support for unwed mothers. And today the world has changed a little bit, but the vision for Highlands is still the same. The difference is it is now primarily kids having kids. That's who comes and lives in our Highlands program. It's children that are in the foster care system that find themselves with child. Some as young as 13, even 12 years old, that don't have anywhere to go, and the system has no way to take care of that. So we've stepped up with our Highlands program, and that's what that is. That's on our campus as well. I will tell you, and we'll circle back to this in a little bit before I wrap up with you this morning, Highlands is my favorite ministry on that campus. Even though my responsibility is CompaCare and foster care, my favorite ministry is Highlands, and we'll get back to that, and you'll understand exactly why when we wrap up here. This is the ministry that has really captured my heart. I graduated from Bible college in 2001 and immediately went to work in the local church. I pastored for years, primarily in Oklahoma. I'm from western Oklahoma, so the lay of the land up here is not all that different from where I grew up. Very similar, flat and fields as far as the eye can see, and the wind always blows. Does the wind blow up here? I've only been here a short time. It hasn't really blown that hard, but I remember when I first moved my wife to Woodward, Oklahoma, where I was raised, she was getting groceries at Walmart and trying to put groceries in the trunk, and the car attacked her. The trunk lid blew down on top of her head and left a big knot. She said, "You brought me out here to the place where nature attacks you." She said, I can't stand this wind. But after 15 years of serving the local church, pastoring churches, we traveled to Hot Springs, Arkansas to tour the facility there at Hillcrest Children's Home because my wife was originally adopted out of that agency as a baby, and we had never been there before. And so we wanted to go see it, and we went and toured. We were asking them how our church could partner with them, how we could help raise funds, that type of thing. And as we pulled onto that campus, the Lord began to tug so hard at our hearts that we knew that He was in it. And we knew that there was something that this was more than just a a tour of the campus. And I looked over at my wife. She had tears streaming down her cheeks as we pulled up wound through the campus. And I knew that God was dealing with us. And before we left, the executive director offered us both positions. And we resigned our church and we went there what we thought was for a season. The problem was, while we were there, the Lord began to show some things to me about a glaring need in the body of Christ, a glaring need in the church. And that's what I want to share with you this morning. That's what I'm here to talk to you about. I'm going to be looking at the story of Nehemiah with you, the first chapter of Nehemiah specifically. We're going to talk about the prophet Nehemiah and how the Lord used him to do an incredible work in Jerusalem. So, Nehemiah in the first chapter, I just want to read this passage to you, first couple of verses, and then we'll just dive right in. Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1 says, "The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hakaliah. Now it happened in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, while I was in Susa, the capital, that Hanani, one of my brothers, and some men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and had survived the captivity about Jerusalem." Let me ask you a question. Have you ever asked somebody a question that you didn't really want to know the answer to? Some of you are probably guilty of that this morning when you came in and shook somebody else's hand and you said, "How you doing?" Let's be honest. You don't really want to know. Because some of us in here, if we really told you how we were doing, we'd mess up your perfectly good Sunday. Right? How you doing? Well, I'm glad you asked. You just wouldn't believe. And as soon as someone starts that, as soon as you ask somebody, "How you doing?" and they start rubbing their head and they say, "Oh," the first thing that comes into your mind is, "What's my exit strategy here?" How do I crawfish out the front door? I can't believe I got myself in this position. Don't ever ask a question you don't want to know the answer to. Like, for instance, your wife goes shopping. She comes home. Although I don't know where you would do that here. Where I guess there are places to go shopping, right? Your wife goes shopping. She comes home with a brand new dress. One question you don't want to ask is, "How much did you pay for that?" The damage is done. She bought the thing. You don't want to ask her what she paid for it because it doesn't really matter, right? Don't ask a question you don't want to know the answer to. So here's what happened with Nehemiah. A little backstory on Nehemiah. Nehemiah was part of a group of people that had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. His family had been taken into captivity by the Babylonians. During this time, it was a very dark time in Israel's history. Babylon had come and overtaken the entire nation, had leveled the city of Jerusalem, and performed what I call a brain drain. They took all the best and the brightest in Israel and took them into captivity and put the really sharp ones into service of the king. This is kind of how Daniel got in the place where Daniel was, and the 3 Hebrew children. And Nehemiah was kind of part of that group. But as time goes on, a new king arose in Babylon and allowed some of the people to go back home. But Nehemiah had made a choice not to go back home. You know why? Because he had a really good thing going. He had become the cupbearer to the king in Babylon, which means he got to live in, hang out in, and enjoy all the luxuries of the palace. So he spent all of his time hanging out in the palace, eating the king's food, drinking the king's wine, enjoying all of the luxuries that went with that job, a lot of perks, pretty sweet gig. And he didn't want to give it up. So when a lot of the other people began to trickle back to Jerusalem and go back to their homeland, Nehemiah decided he would stick and stay right where he was. So with that kind of in the background of his story, we read about Nehemiah's brother and a couple of other people coming from Jerusalem, passing through town, and they said, "Hey, I remember Nehemiah. He's hanging out here in Susa, the capital city. Let's stop in and see him, talk to him about how things are going." So they stop by. They come in and get an audience with Nehemiah, and while they're hanging out and talking to him, I can just imagine how impressed they were with the lifestyle that he was living. Because remember, they'd come from Jerusalem, a city that was lying in ruins, and here they were talking to Nehemiah in the palace, looking around at all the stuff he gets to enjoy. Grapes as big as a man's fist, the fruit, the meat, the endlessly flowing wine. And they say to Nehemiah, Nehemiah, you really got it made here. And then Nehemiah makes the key mistake that would change the trajectory of his life. He says, guys, how are things really in Jerusalem? Tell me about how things are going. This is what it says in verse 2. Hanani, one of my brothers, some of the men from Judah came, and I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped and who had survived the captivity, and about Jerusalem. And they said, you really want to know? We'll tell you, but you won't like it. They said to me, the remnant there in the province who survived the captivity are in great distress and reproach, and the wall of Jerusalem is broken down, and its gates are burned with fire. And it was an assault on Nehemiah's senses. Every detail they unloaded on him shook him to his core, and the Bible says he began to weep because of what he had just heard. He asked a question that he really didn't want to know the answer to, but once he came into possession of that piece of knowledge, he was never going to be the same. This, friends, is exactly what's happened to me, and I want to share that burden with you this morning. I've asked a question that I really didn't want to ask, and I've heard an answer that I can't unhear. What is the question? The question is, what is the real state of the family today in America? What is the real state of families across our country, and even right here in this country, in this county? I wish I'd have never asked the question, because I really was enjoying my life before I came to know the answer. I feel a little bit like Nehemiah. I could have gone on living forever the way that I was living until I came into possession of this piece of knowledge. Let me share with you some of the things that I have come to know this morning. First of all, families are crumbling at an unprecedented rate. The devil has decided that the highest value target for him is the family. And he has decided that he's going to focus his attention and his efforts on destroying families all across our nation. And it's a very brilliant move, because the family is so pivotal and so critical to our fabric, to our morality, to our discipleship, to everything that the church stands for. The family is the little church. We have long suspected that something was wrong with our country. I know all the years that I pastored, I always suspected that something was a little off and things were getting worse. We saw the evidence. We saw the effects of it. We saw people that went through difficult divorces and split-ups. We saw children that were affected by parents who were drug addicts. I saw these little pieces here and there. I saw a country that seemed to be losing her way. I saw, just like you saw on the evening news, where people couldn't figure out which bathroom to use, and it seemed so strange and so foreign. And I never put all the pieces together until God directed me to come and serve at Compact, and I began to really immerse myself in this whole world of brokenness in the family, and all of a sudden it started to make sense. All the while, I've been blaming everything. I've been blaming politicians for the state that our nation is in. I've been blaming Democrats or Republicans for the state that we're in. Public schools and the media and superstars and athletes. I've been blaming people like Colin Kaepernick. That's the reason that our country is in the state that it is. And all the while, the Lord was slowly dropping these hints and these nuggets, these breadcrumbs, bread trails in my heart. And as I followed them, I learned that the real problem is that we've lost our families. Our families have disintegrated. We've lamented over how drastically the culture in our nation has changed. But it's really not any of these other things that we go to lunch and we complain about on a Sunday. We say, can you believe how bad our country is? Can you believe how bad the Democrats or the Republicans have made it? Can you believe that athlete? But all the while, the devil is just smiling ear to ear because he's stolen the most important thing right out from under our nose, and none of us are talking about it. Years ago, there was a story that was popular during the Korean War. I had a pastor that I served under as a youth pastor that served in Korea, and he swears that this story happened on his watch, but I've since heard it a lot of different times in different ways, so I'm sure it happened at some point. But a security guard on a base over in Korea, a military policeman, was responsible for checking people as they came in and out of the base. And there were some local Korean contractors that would work on the base. And every day they would walk out of the base pushing a wheelbarrow full of sawdust. And the guards were convinced that something was in that sawdust. They were hiding something in that sawdust, stealing something. And so every day the guard would comb through all that sawdust with his fingers, and he would look and look, trying to figure out what is it these people are stealing from the base. And every day, same thing, a wheelbarrow full of sawdust, wheelbarrow full of sawdust. Well, soon enough, this guard was relieved of his post, and he was going to be moving to another assignment. And he stopped that guy on his last day on the post, and he said, "Sir, I have been combing through this sawdust every single day, trying to figure out what you're stealing, and I can't find it." And the guy just looked at him and smiled, and he said, "I've been stealing wheelbarrows this whole time." He said, "I got a shop building full of wheelbarrows." That's what I believe has happened in our country. I believe we've been sifting through the after effects of the meltdown of the family, and we've not woken up to the fact that it's the family, it's the family, it's the family, it's the family. If we can move the needle on fatherlessness in our country, we'll move the needle on every other problem. If we can move the needle on the brokenness in our families, we'll move the needle on every other problem that we could complain about this morning. Fathers have gone MIA, friends. Last night, over half of all children in America went to bed without the opportunity to say goodnight to their biological father. Let that sink in for just a minute. We have crossed the halfway point in our country. What happened, we trace the single-parent birth rate in our nation through the U.S. Census that's released every 10 years. And in 1960, and prior to that, as far back as we have traced it, as far back as anybody has ever cared to measure that statistic, it is set at about 4%. So roughly 4 out of every 100 babies in America were born to single-parent households up until about 1960. From 1960 to today, we've seen a 1,000% skyrocket in that statistic. And in 2020, when the new census comes out in a couple of years, for the first time in the history of our nation, we're going to see that a majority of all babies are now born to single-parent households. From 4% in 1960 to a majority today. Once we cross that threshold, friends, once we cross that point, I think we're all going to wish we would have had both eyes on this problem. It's going to become such a massive issue that has tentacles that go all through the church. And it needs to be the issue that the church has her eyes on today. How can we support families the way that God designed them? How can we encourage couples to stay together? How can we redeem those who are caught in the clutches of life-controlling substances? How can we redeem children who are caught in a system that was never designed to raise them? A government system. We can talk about a lot of reasons why this destructive trend of fatherlessness has taken place. And believe me, I've done a lot of research on this, and I've found some really good smoking guns of why we're in the position that we're in. Back in the 60s, we had this thing called the sexual revolution. We had the women's liberation movement. We had the birth control pill, by the way, which was one of the drivers. It was the first time that we separated sexual intimacy from marriage. Officially, we divorced the two. Government programs that disincentivized marriage and continue to disincentivize marriage. I don't know if you ever saw this, Pastor Chris, but I saw this. I saw people in my churches that refused to get married because they'd lose government money. So they just cohabitate or live together. So we've got government programs that now augment and subsidize single parenting, but disincentivize marriage. All these things have worked together in one giant mess to drive the rate of single parents and drive the rate of fatherlessness through the roof. Here's what bothers me as a church, and I'm guilty of this. As a pastor, every year in January, my wife and I would champion the cause of sanctity of human life. We would get up and rail against abortion because we felt it was the right thing to do. We planted our flag on that issue. But today, I feel grieved that I did that, and I'll tell you why. Because if you eliminated fatherlessness today, you would eliminate 85% of all abortions. 85% of all abortions in America are performed when there's no father that cares at all. No father in the picture. Many of the times don't even know about what's happening. So it's a shell game. We've looked over here at this big issue of abortion and we've said, I'll only vote for politicians that outlaw abortion. But at the same time, we've missed the bigger issue. We've missed the wheelbarrow that goes right out the door of fatherlessness that's driving those numbers up. We've got to support fathers being fathers. We've got to teach men how to be men, young men how to be dads. And we've got to pray for and support and encourage couples to stay together. Mothers have been forced to play dual roles, decoding for their boys and their girls, both a masculine and a feminine role. Pray for single mothers. Pray for them. They've got a hard job, and they need the church's support. They need the church's support. They need the rest of us to wrap around and support them. I'm not at all blaming single mothers for the problem we're in. I think we should put our arms around them and we should do everything we can to support them and offer to be involved in their kids' lives as much as they will let us. Offer to take their sons fishing, whatever. The church is a great place to augment some of the damage that's been done, to heal some of the damage that's been done to our children that are being forced to be raised with no dad present in their life. But I will tell you this, and I want to be careful how I say this because I don't want you to draw the wrong conclusion from this, but it's very interesting to me that when you trace some of the modern contemporary problems that didn't exist 50 years ago, things like gender confusion, things like fluid gender, things like the rise in homosexuality to the point that our White House can be painted with rainbow colors. It's interesting when you track those problems on a graph, historically, they fall in lockstep with the rise in fatherlessness. The fact that we don't have clear gender roles being presented for our children. This is a major issue that the church has got to have both eyes on. And then in many instances, both mom and dad are unable to be parents. And for that reason, we have a skyrocketing number of grandparents raising their grandchildren. This has become a very common practice across our nation. Grandparents getting involved in raising their grandchildren. And I think it's fantastic that the Lord has those grandparents as a safety valve in those kids' lives. I think it's wonderful. But I also think that it's a symptom of a deeper problem that we need to look at as a nation. How can we heal families? How can we, at the same time, thank God and give praise to God for those grandmothers who are and grandfathers that are willing to step into that kid's life, celebrate them and support them, and not take anything away from that, but at the same time, begin to pray for and support in every way we can the healing of that family. Research shows that children fare substantially better in school when they have both a mom and a dad in the house. It's not Christian research, that's secular research that has shown that in virtually every arena of education, they do better when they have mom and dad in the house together. Another major study that I came across in some of my research at AGTS links adverse childhood experiences such as going through a divorce or suffering from abuse or seeing violence or those types of things, links all of those things to problems later in life, like drug abuse or incarceration or unplanned pregnancy. In other words, it's a system that perpetuates itself. You see it, you do it. You see it, you do it. You experience it later. Our values and our faith were both things that were designed by God to be transmitted from generation to generation by moms and dads. Can I tell you something? The church was never meant to be the primary discipler of your children. That's you. That's you. The children's pastor, the youth. Are you the youth pastor? Pastor Carly? Pastor Carly, I'm so grateful to God that He sent you here to serve these youth. But it's not your job to disciple them, right? It's the job of moms and dads. It's her job to support you and augment what you're doing. It's not Pastor Chris's job to disciple your kids. It's the church. It's not the church's job to do that. It's the church's job to support and augment what the family is doing. It was always meant for moms and dads to model their faith for kids and for kids to pick it up from them. The church is a stopgap for when that can't happen, but we're not meant to be the primary discipler. And certainly the government was not supposed to transmit values to your kids. Certainly even the school system. Thank God for godly teachers like Denise and maybe others that are in the room today that teach our kids and model those kinds of godly values. But it was never meant to be the school that was the primary discipler of your kids. It was meant to be mom and dad doing that together and upholding that standard. And the worst thing to me is that we've now had enough generations of fatherlessness and enough generations of broken families that many young men and women cannot picture in their mind the way that a family should work. And so we've crossed the point now where kids are starting to grow up and have kids of their own, and they've never seen it work. They've never seen fatherhood work. They've never seen family actually work, but yet here they are, repopulating the earth and perpetuating a problem of fatherlessness. I'll tell you this morning, it is the heart's cry of every child to be loved unconditionally by their parents. When I first started in the role that I'm in now, my official title is the Arkansas Director of Foster Care for Compact. And when I first started in that role, 2 years prior, I served as a case manager on our campus, which is essentially our version of a social worker on our campus. And one of my responsibilities was to go out to the cottages when there was a problem. I would go out and I would support the foster family. And if they had a problem, there were certain nights that I served as our on-call. So they would call me and say, I really need your help. And I would go over there and let them take care of the rest of the kids while I ministered to the one that was having the issue. So I got called out one night for a little boy. I wish I could share his name or some more details about it. But I will tell you this young man was about 12 years old, and he was really having a hard time that night, settling down. It was about bedtime. And when I got to the cottage, they were the house parents were putting the rest of the kids to bed, and I asked if I could take this young man and go on a walk with him. So I took him, we'll just say his name was Johnny. I took Johnny, and I said, let's go for a walk. So we walked that 50-acre campus, made a couple of laps, just enough to kind of wear him out a little bit and calm him down. And he wouldn't tell me what his real problem was. He couldn't say. He just was angry. And so after we walked a couple of laps, I said, are you ready to go back and go to bed? He said, yeah, I think I am. So we got to his cottage. His roommate was already in bed. And I put him in bed, pulled the covers up. I said, Johnny, can I pray for you tonight? And he said, yes. And so I took his hand and I said, is there anything specific you want me to pray for you about? And he said, yes. He said, I just want a family. He said, I'm so tired of not having a family. I want a family of my own. He said, can you pray for that? Is that the kind of thing that God would answer? And I said, it absolutely is the kind of thing God will answer. And so I took his hand, and I don't know if this expression means anything to you or not, but it does to me. I prayed from my toes. I prayed. I called on God. And I said, Lord, this little boy needs to know that you're hearing his prayer tonight. And I said, he's asking for a family, and I know there's one out there for him, God. Give this boy a family. And when I finished praying and said amen, I went to let go, and he grabbed my hand tighter, and he said, wait just a minute, don't go anywhere. And I said, why? And he took his sheets, and he began to wipe the tears that were running out of his eyes, and he said, I don't want anybody to see me like this. Don't open the door yet. And I said, listen, Johnny, I said, God has seen, and he cares, and he's going to answer this prayer. And he said, okay. And once I got him calmed down and he got his tears dried, I opened the door and I turned and I walked down the long hallway to the front door of his cottage. And just before I got to the front door, I felt a tug on my shirt. And I turned around and he'd gotten out of bed and followed me down the hall. And he said, Mr. Lance? And I said, yeah. And he said, since we just prayed just now, about how long do you think it will take before I get a family? And I asked him, I said, Johnny, can I tell that story everywhere I go? Can I tell your story? Because I know there's a family out there for you. Thank God he was able to be connected with a family, and I give thanks for that. But there are so many other children that are praying that same kind of prayer, night after night after night. Their heart's cry is to be loved by and accepted by a family. And I pray the Lord would give us the day, God, when you'll turn the hearts of the fathers back to the children. I was reading recently the story of the Good Samaritan. I've preached that story. I'll preach that story. That's a fun story to preach because you get to talk about the heart of God. So I've heard it, preached it, read it, every way you can slice it. But all of a sudden I was reading it recently, and it's like an anvil set down on my shoulders as the Lord opened my eyes and He showed me. He said, if today the Lord Jesus were here telling that story, it would read differently. Because it would be a dad in a pigsty and a little boy on the front porch with his arms open wide. It would be a little boy looking down the road to see when dad's going to come home. It wouldn't be the prodigal son, it would be the prodigal dad. God, turn the hearts of your children, of your fathers, back to your children. Give us a passion to support these kinds of the families and what they're going through and the struggles that they're in and the failure of the church to respond to this. Forgive us, God. Do you feel anything this morning? Nehemiah was deeply moved by the reports that he heard. He was deeply moved. And in verse 4 it says, when I heard these words, I sat down and I wept and I mourned for days. Grieved. I don't know if you've ever cried till you had nothing left to cry. Where your stomach is just twisted. And he began to pray, and here's the thing. Honestly, let's be real. Nehemiah had a good life. So what in the world did a broken wall hundreds of miles away really have to do with him? How did that really affect his day-to-day life? He asked his brother how things were going in Jerusalem, and they told him the news, and it was bad. It was ugly. It's kind of like what I'm telling you today about the broken families. But how does it really affect you? How does it really affect you? Why should it matter to us? Because most of us in the room have managed somehow to live decent lives, you know. Probably, I don't know this congregation, but I'm going to guess that many of you in the room, your families are intact. You've got your normal, your version of normal. Although I push back on that. I say there's no such thing as a normal family. They don't exist. I don't know what brand of abnormal you are, but it works for you, right? It works for your family. So how does that really affect us? What does that really matter? But yet Nehemiah allowed someone else's pain hundreds of miles away into his heart, and it drove him to action. That's what the ministry of foster care is about. That's what the ministry of redeeming families is about. It's about looking in the mirror and saying, God, you've been so good to me. But there are others out there that need what I got. Because can I just tell you, every blessing you have in your life came to you on its way to somebody else. Think of it like that. That the favor of God in your life came to you on its way to somebody else. The salvation of the Lord came to you on its way to somebody else. And when we begin to see ourselves as a channel and as a conduit of God's blessings, then all of a sudden we find ourselves in Nehemiah's position, hearing about the brokenness around him and allowing someone else's pain into his heart, and allowing himself to feel and to take a step and to turn his compassion into action. I need to wrap up, so I want to share this with you. If the church isn't the answer to the brokenness in this world, then who is? If the church doesn't step up to be who the church was designed to be, a city on a hill, a channel of God's love and grace, and mercy, then who will? And the answer to that is no one. Government systems aren't designed to handle that kind of load. I'm thankful for government systems. They get a black eye. Government social services and child protective services, they get a black eye. They're all the time getting black eyes in the news, and people are always complaining about them. But I'm thankful that they exist, because no more than the church has stepped up, we'd really be in trouble if they didn't exist. But what we need next is for the church to wake up and to say, this is what God has called us to do, to redeem broken people. So I want to circle back this morning, and I want to share briefly the story of how God planted this ministry in my heart. And I want to tell you about my wife. My wife was adopted out of Heartland's maternity home back in 1980 as a baby. That tells you how old we are. And it was a closed adoption, so she didn't know anything about her biological family. She was raised by the family that had fostered her for 4 years. They eventually adopted her and kept her and raised her as part of that family. And they've been good to her, and they're still good to her. That's mom and dad to her. They've moved to Hot Springs now to be close to us, and we never knew any different. But I'll never forget when my oldest child, who is now almost 19 years old, when he was born, we were in the hospital, and my wife was holding that baby boy, and she looked at me and she said, "This is the first flesh and blood I've ever known." And she said, "I've got to know my story. I cannot imagine giving this child up for adoption, and I've got to go find the story. I'm going to find the story one way or another." And I know my wife well enough to know she was going to find the story. And so none of you are married to a hard-headed wife. I know that. None of you wives are married to a hard-headed husband either. But I was convinced that we're going to find this woman, and so I better get on board and help her. And so she and I began to go on a journey that, for time's sake, I can't share it all with you. But it was quite a journey. It took us about a year. It involved purchasing long lists on the internet and piecing together little clues that different people had told us here and there. And before it was all said and done, we were able to connect with her biological mother, who was living in Vermont. And when we did, we bought a plane ticket, and we flew up to Vermont, and we wanted to meet her in person. We took our baby. And we sat across the kitchen table from her in this little, I wouldn't even call it a house. It was what's left of a house. Dirt floors, abject poverty, right on the banks of a river in Vermont. And as we sat there across the table from her, asking about the story, she began to spin a story for us that left our jaws hanging open. She said, "Yeah," she said, "I remember well." She said, "I was a parole officer's assistant, and I had gotten involved with a man that was on parole that had come into our office. I dated him a couple of times until one night he confessed to me that he had murdered somebody. And it scared me because no one knew. And so I told him I just couldn't continue this relationship, and I broke it off with him. And the next day I went home from work, and when I walked into my apartment, he was hiding in the apartment and ambushed me, slammed the door, locked it, and he abused me that night. He said when he had finished having his way with me, he looked at me and he said, "There's no way I can leave you alive, because if I leave you alive, I'll go to prison." He said, "I've got to kill you now." And he took a step towards her, and for the first time in her life, she prayed. This woman had no faith background at all, but in that moment, she knew that she was about to die. And she prayed and cried out to the Lord, and she said, "God, if you're there, if you exist, I need your help right now." And in that moment, that man had a grand mal seizure, fell to the ground having a seizure, and she was able to run out the front door and scream for help. And the neighbors came and rallied around her and took her to get a medical exam, and he went to prison. We later verified all this story. We even talked to a prison guard that knew him. And a few weeks goes by, and a month goes by, and all of a sudden, she realizes that she's got a baby, that she's going to have a baby. And she knew there was no way that she could take care of this child. And so she stumbled into the storefront. She remembered praying. She remembered asking God to save her that night, and he did. And so the second time she prayed, the Lord directed her to a little storefront Assembly of God church in White River Junction, Vermont. She'd already been to the doctor. The doctor had confirmed the pregnancy. She had asked to have an abortion, and the doctor had told her it would be $50, and she didn't have $50. So she stumbled into this little Assembly of God church in White River Junction, Vermont, and she waited through the service, and she got the pastor afterwards and pulled him to the side, and she said, "Excuse me, Pastor, I need $50 to have an abortion. I've been through something terrible, and I just need to have an abortion." And the pastor looked at her in such grace and said, "I'm sorry, we don't do that, but I do know of a place called Heartland's Maternity Home. And if you're willing, we'll pass the offering plate. and we'll buy a plane ticket for you and we'll send you to Highlands. And the church, the very next Sunday, passed the offering plate, took up an offering, and sent her to Highlands Maternity Home, where she was able to give this baby up for adoption. So as she's telling us this story, I was in awe. I was in awe. I could not believe this was not the story that I expected to hear at all, much less my wife. But it happened to be on a Wednesday night. Wednesday late afternoon, she's telling us this story. And we asked her, we said, so whatever happened to that church? It's been, 20 years now. Whatever happened to that church? She said, oh, I gave my heart to the Lord. And she said, I go there every time the doors are open. And I said, well, what about tonight? Do they have a Wednesday night service? She said, yeah, I'll be going. And we said, can we go with you? And my wife and I loaded up and went with her that Wednesday night, walked through the doors of that little church of about 36 people, and we met the people that saved her life. We shook the hands of the people that put money in the plate 20 years earlier to send her to that maternity home. And to this day, it's one of the most humbling moments of my life. The hair still stands up on the back of my neck when I think of that night. But here's what I want you to take away from that. What happens if the church isn't ready to be the church? What happens if she runs into somebody judgmental before she runs into the pastor? What happens if the prodigal comes home and he runs into the older brother before he runs into the father? The church has got to be ready to be the church. The church has got to be ready to embrace the broken and the lost and the least. What would happen if God filled the church with people like that woman that's got some miles on her, some hard miles, have some drug exposure and have some brokenness in their story. And all of us have chapters in our book that we don't want read out loud. But what if she's got a whole book that none of it's appropriate to read out loud? I pray that God will make us ready to be the church. Make us ready to put our arms around the unlovable and the hurting. Make us not only feel the brokenness of other people, but to be driven to action, to do something about it. What can you do? Well, some of you in this room, I will tell you this. Nehemiah's strategy, he told the people, he said, go rebuild the wall that's in front of your house. In chapter 3, he outlines his strategy. He says, this is your family, this is your responsibility. This is your family, this is your responsibility. Because he knew that there wasn't anybody there that could build that whole wall. But he knew that everybody could build what was in front of their house. So the strategy to redeem the family in America starts with going home and loving your wife. Going home and loving your husband. Going home and committing yourself to your family. That's strategy number one. And then looking at what else you can do to get involved in the life of a kid somewhere who's living in pain and brokenness and hurting. May not be able to save them all. 440,000 kids today in the foster care system. This church isn't going to solve that whole problem. But don't think of it in terms of this church. Think of it in terms of you, your family. What can you do? Some of you can take in a child in the foster care system. Some of you can wrap around and support a family that's willing to do that. Some of you can take in your grandkids and love on them. And some of the rest of you can wrap around and support those grandparents while they do that. As we're ministering to and praying for and hoping for and cheering for the restoration of that family and believing for that. Can I pray for you this morning? I want to thank you for allowing me to come and share. I count it a huge privilege and honor to be out here. Pastor Chris, it's a blessing to be with you. And I hope that maybe the Lord has spoken to you this morning about ways that you can get involved in redeeming the family. Let's pray to that end. Lord, what a privilege it is today to be able to share your heart on these difficult matters. I thank you, Lord, that you have raised the church up for this hour, that we can embrace and we can love the lost and least of these. And I pray that you'd take the words that we've shared here today and that you'd find a deep lodging place in the hearts of your people here today. In Jesus' name, amen.